Hi, guys. So today we're talking about Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates. Talked a little bit in class today about our different reactions to the story. And y'all, this one always gets diverse reactions. Some people love it, some people are horrified, some people are just thoroughly confused and conflicted. And I think that a great story prompts all of those reactions in us. That there are going to be points in the story where you're like, that's really brilliant, and points where you're really freaked out by it. Joyce Carol Oates is a masterful writer. So, going to go through this PowerPoint very quickly because I know that we're not going to get through everything in class today, and there's a lot of information I'd like to share with you. So, we talked a little bit today about the plot of the story. Every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Kind of the significant points plot-wise of this story. And the setting of the story is really important as well. There's a few clues to it. Connie's wearing shorts and ballerina flats, charm bracelets, this big boys reference, the asbestos ranch house, even the transistor radio, the house phone, there's no cells. So this story is set in the 1960s. And again, that's important when we're considering where our American society was at the time. If you pull in a little bit of historical criticism, you know that in the 1960s, we have this massive youth revolution where young people were starting to become more vocal in social movements and in political movements. And there's this real search for identity that young people aren't just children and babies, but they are independent, free thinking individuals who are trying to find their direction and their path in life. And that definitely leads to one of the biggest themes in the story, and that is identity and the search for self. So, there's the obvious question of who is Arnold Friend? Why is he here? But Oates is actually really asking us to question Connie and her identity. Who is she as an individual? Who is she as a woman? So if we look at her character, she's right on that cusp of childhood and adulthood. She's 15, which I think is an important point because at 15, that's a sophomore, mostly sophomore in high school. Most of us look at 15-year-olds and don't think of them as being adults, right? But when you're 15, you do feel like an adult. So it's this kind of conflicting time in our lives. Connie has this kind of laughing habit, giggling habit. On the surface, she likes to pretend to be a little vapid, a little unaware, but we know that she's not. We know that she has some deep feelings and deep thoughts. She does try to be rebellious. She is constantly pushing boundaries a little bit. And again, y'all, that's that transition from childhood to adulthood. We all go through that phase, and some of us for longer than others, where we push boundaries to figure out who we are and what's important to us. So I think it's interesting to note that Connie is kind of duplicitous in her nature, not in a malicious way, but just in her search to become who she is. Oates writes that everything about her had two sides to it, right? So she's one person out and about in public, and she's one person at home. She's one person with her friends and the boys at the diner. She's another person with her family. And Connie values that outward appearance. She knows how to play the game a little bit and how to present herself depending on the situation. And that's part of growing up too, that we learn how to kind of put on certain faces, certain attitudes, depending on our situation. You're not the same person, or you probably don't speak the same way that you do with your friend group that you do your parents. You may not always have the same persona on when you're at school as when you're at home or when you're at work or when you're at church or wherever. That we all kind of have had to learn how to present ourselves. And Connie's learning that. So that search for identity, that search for self, can definitely be seen in her fights with her sister. And that's June's role in the story, that June is plain. She's not interesting. She's boring. She's not rebellious. She's just kind of there. And she's exactly what the parents want her to be, which is controllable. And she's a foil to Connie and almost a cautionary tale for Connie. Connie doesn't want to be June, right? She doesn't want to be plain and boring and work at her high school. Connie wants to go a different direction. She wants to be her own person. Now, Connie definitely values her physical beauty. And again, that's not atypical of someone in their mid to young teens, that physical appearance is important. She's constantly messing with her hair. She's worried about her clothes. She wants to make sure she's attractive to the young men. This is important though, because that fascination with her outward appearance combined with her unstable identity makes her a perfect victim for Arnold Friend. She pretends to be very self-confident and ebullient and, you know, jovial and happy, but that's a facade, right? And the people who tend to be the most concerned about their outward appearances also can be people who are extremely conflicted about their appearances. These are people who maybe have some body dysmorphia or other underlying issues that Connie's not as self-confident as she pretends to be. And Arnold Friend can see that. And he uses that to get to her, right? So he comes at her with these compliments and these comments, and he's trying to appeal to her vanity. And once he does that, he can kind of worm his way into other aspects of her personality and her mind. So Connie does have that low self-esteem. And she has a fear of intimacy, which is juxtaposed to her being intimate with strangers, right? She goes off into these alleys or she crosses the road with these boys. She's looking for validation, right? And she's using physical intimacy to validate her existence. And it's because she doesn't feel valid. She doesn't feel beautiful. She doesn't feel happy on the inside. So she's trying to kind of fake it till she makes it. So like I said, June is included as a foil to Connie. The parents are interesting here because Connie's dad is very absent in the story. Even when he's physically there, he's emotionally gone. And Connie's mother, with relationship with her mother, is very challenging. As many teenage girls have relationships, challenging relationships with their moms. That's a hard time in a young woman's life because, again, she's learning how to grow up. And most often our moms want to help us with that. And it's hard to accept that help, or it's hard to offer support and help because when the mom was a teenager, times were very different. So this relationship with Connie's mom is extremely challenging. It's important to note by the end of the story, though, she's calling out for her mom. She wants her mother. That ultimately, in the end, she's not as mature, she's not as independent as she wanted to think she was. So another theme in the story, another deeper meaning of the story is the difference between appearance and reality. We already see that in Connie's character. The persona that Connie presents isn't who she really is. The appearance that she puts out there isn't her actual reality. And Arnold Friend absolutely plays into the establishment of this theme. So if you think about it, Arnold Friend on the surface looks appealing, right? When she sees him across the parking lot, he's this boy with shaggy black hair in a convertible. He stares at her, so she immediately feels, intrigued or a little flirtatious, right? She cuts her eyes at him and she looks away. She flirts with him and he's still there, right? So this is a little bit of a play between them. It gets a little freaky though when he wags his finger in front of her and says, "Gonna get you, babe." For most of us, we would be freaked out by that, unnerved by that. But Connie is oddly, interested in that. And again, it speaks to her fear of rejection, her fear of intimacy. It speaks to her low self-esteem. And he knows all that, y'all, because he can see through her. He can see that the Connie on the outside, the Connie she's presenting, isn't the real Connie. Her first impression is that he is her kind of guy, right? It's only when she gets to see him closer up and she gets to know him a little bit that she realizes he's not who he appears to be, right? He presents this tone of tension and uneasiness. From a distance, she's comfortable with him. It's when he's up close to her that she feels extremely concerned by his presence. So she's drawn to him and yet afraid of him. She hears this voice in her head that says that he's trouble, and yet she ignores the voice. And y'all, that's also part of her journey into adulthood. Learning how to listen to your gut or your intuition or that voice inside your head is something that as adults, we have to learn how to do, to trust our instincts. Connie's too young to do that. But if you look at the way she looks at him in the inner dialogue in Connie's head, she knows he's trouble. And she knows this is dangerous and she knows this is a problem, but she can't reconcile that with her desire, her curiosity until the very end, when she realizes that desire, that curiosity is what's going to lead to the resolution of the story. That her willingness to kind of welcome him in is eventually going to cause her death. So Arnold Friend blends romance and fear to appeal to her and ultimately to control her, right? He knows who she is. He can see her for who she is. And he's able to get into her head and manipulate her because, again, she's unsure of who she is, and he sees that. And he says, I took a special interest in you, such a pretty girl. You know, there's all these other girls at the diner, all these other people he could hurt, but he zeroes in on her because she's weak and he sees it. So he uses her lack of identity to manipulate her. So we talked a little bit today about who Arnold Friend actually is. And his name is interesting because if you play with it a little bit, you get a friend, which is ironic, y'all, because he's not a friend, right? What he's going to do to her is not friendly or kind. In fact, the better interpretation is he's a fiend, an old fiend. And who's the oldest fiend? It's the devil. So if you think about the argument that Arnold is the devil, there's all these little clues throughout the story. The fact that he disguises his appearance, the fact that he can see things that he should not be able to see, and he knows things that he should not know. His ability to kind of use her weakness against her. Biblically, all goes with, you know, the Judeo-Christian presentation of a devil figure or a Satan figure. So again, he's not a friend, y'all, and that psychological criticism is all about his action and how his actions are really from the very beginning extremely dangerous. And he is a psychopath and, you know, violent and threatening her from the very outset. The first moment he sees her, when he wags his finger in the air in front of her, he tells her in the beginning he's going to hurt her. She just doesn't understand it. So he represents all that violence and evil and chaos in the world. And he brings it to her doorstep. He's terrifying, y'all. Ellie Oscar is an interesting character, and he's Elvis-like in his representation. And he transitions in the story from this harmless friend into a threat of violence, right? He's just riding along in the car, and it's not until he says, you want that telephone pulled out, that we realize he's an accomplice, that he's also involved in this. And Ellie is meant to represent Elvis, and this is a bit of social commentary, okay? So Joyce Carol Oates uses music in the story. Music's always in the background. It was at the diner, it's at her house, it's in the backyard, it's in the kitchen, it's everywhere. When Arnold Friend pulls up, his car is playing the same radio station that Connie's playing in her house. So for Connie, music is very much associated with, you know, her life, and especially at the diner, with sex. Her feelings for boys are very much mixed up with the music. And Elvis, y'all, in the 1960s, 1950s, 60s was kind of this very controversial sex symbol, right? That he danced in a way that wasn't done before. If you look at music and dancing from the 1930s and 1940s, and then look at how it moves in the late 50s and 60s, it becomes much more physical and much more intimate. My lights just turned off. And so Ellie Oscar represents that transition. Now, Arnold exploits that popular music, right? He uses it again to manipulate her, to get to her in his simple voice. Like he sounds like he's repeating the song. So Ellie is meant to represent this dangerous lure of the music, perhaps even that we don't realize is dangerous until it's too late, and represent these potential themes, including the effects of popular culture, the nature of sexual desire, the dangers of manipulation. So Ellie's certainly multi-layered in his presence, although he's not an incredibly dynamic character. Also, side note, the real serial killer it's a real killer, that Arnold Friend is based on had accomplices, people who went along with his murders and helped support him. So Oates could be referring to that too, that the loyal companions of Charles Schmidt, the original killer that she bases on. So the original title of the story was Death and the Maiden. Okay, and she changed it to Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? And There's so many interpretations to that, y'all, and she's never really confirmed anything about the story. The title sounds like questions you'd expect a parent to ask, and yet no one does of Connie, which represents, again, this kind of moment between adolescence and adulthood. Perhaps her parents are trying to give her space, and yet they've given her too much, right? That we all need some boundaries and we all need some expectations. Like we talked about last week, we're better people when someone's watching us. No one's really watching Connie. It's also a reference to Judges 19:17, which is a biblical story about a murder. So, she's kind of playing with that as well. This could also be a reference to the numbers on Arnold Friend's car, although there's multiple interpretations about those numbers as well. Some people think about them as being biblical in nature or a connection to Arnold Friend. Perhaps he is 33. And if we look at the victims, maybe he's killed people before. We have a descending number, as we talked about. Like Charles Schmidt in real life was in his late 20s, early 30s when he started killing people. He killed a 19-year-old. He killed a 17-year-old. So this descending age of victims, Connie's 15, leads us to kind of question who's the next victim, how old will the next victim be? But also, if you count, this is where it gets a little weird. If you count backwards in the Bible, Judges from the back, okay, counting from the back in, is the 33rd book. So if we invert that order, kind of like the inverted idea, like the idea of an inverted, the devil is often represented with inversion or being backwards or being, incorrect. Perhaps that's where the title comes from as well, or, the numbers. There's so many things to it, y'all. We talked a little bit today in class about some of the deeper parts of this story. That Joyce is definitely commenting on the violence in American society. In the 1960s, we start to see this escalation of violence. We're talking about early Vietnam War, and we know in the 1960s that we start to see things like assassinations, JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King. In the late 60s, we're going to see the Manson killings, again, where we have a killer who, and this story was written before that, but a killer who doesn't actually commit the murders, but has these loyal companions. So Joyce is definitely commenting on that changing violence in America. Now, whether or not American society was becoming more violent or we were just more willing to talk about it is also a different topic. I mean, it's hard to tell there. She comments on American society in the 1960s, this youth revolution, these changing times in youth culture. And again, that theme of appearance versus reality. So Oates said that she was a chronicler of the American experience. And she claims that we've been a society that's historically prone to violence. And we've liked to kind of ignore that for a long time. So her writing about the violence in America is really more of a commentary on our history as a violent country. Let me see. Like I said, the growth of the suburbs is American society in the 1960s. This story takes place in the suburbs. And y'all, even today, we tend to think of ourselves as safe in the suburbs. And we tend to be more surprised and horrified when a violent crime occurs in the suburbs. And she's commenting on that. That's an incorrect assumption that you're safer in the suburbs. Bad things happen everywhere. Okay, and that may go back to Oates' point about us being a violent country and historically violent. If you contrast the violence that occurs in the story with the very peaceful suburbia that the house, that her home is presented in, that asbestos house, the backyard, the weeds, the line of trees, of course, talk about forests there. We've been talking last week about how forests are a place of danger and violence. There's a contrast here, juxtaposition between the cookie cutterness, that's not really a word, but the cookie cutterness of Connie's home and her life and the violence that's going to happen to her. We also see in the 1960s some changes in family bonds. We start to see changes in the family dynamic. In the mid to late 40s, when women were going back into the workforce during World War II, and then after the war, the men came home, we see a shift in gender culture. And this is where some gender theory would come in, gender criticism, that would be looking at how the changing roles of women have led to this story, right? That Joyce Carol Oates may be commenting on women and how women in the 1960s were starting to talk more about sexuality and intimacy. And that's less of a taboo topic in the 1960s than it was in the 50s and 40s and 30s. I mean, think about how shocked people were in the 1920s when women started wearing shorter skirts and cutting their hair. And then we look at the 1960s, which we think about as being the era of, the youth revolution and free love and hippies and all of that. Although, y'all, there's so much more to it than that. That's a huge change in just 40 years. I mean, that's just a generation right there. That's parents and children. So she's definitely commenting on those changes as well. That disconnected father, too, is a part of that. We have, this commentary on the lack of a father figure in the story. What if Connie's dad had been more involved? What if Connie's dad had been more present? He's away most of the time. So these questions of how our parents play in our lives, how societal expectations play into our lives, and how the changing societies play into who we are in our development and our identities. Talked already a little bit about that. Feminism, the war, an increase in violence and crime. The music in the 60s, y'all, is super representative of this, right? The story is dedicated to Bob Dylan. And that is in part because he was writing music that talked about these things. And he was becoming this voice of the youth in the 1960s. His songs went there, talked about things that weren't discussed before. So where Elvis Presley pushed the envelope a little bit with the physical side of his music, Bob Dylan was pushing it intellectually, emotionally, telling people they have to talk about these things and think about these things. I've already talked a little bit about the appearance versus reality. Here's a little bit more about how she establishes that theme. And these are some of the things that we talked about, how that represent why he's the devil or how he could be portrayed as the devil. And the appearance he presents is one of a suitor. Even in the end, y'all, he's not banging down the kitchen door and attacking her, although she feels like he is, right? She feels like he's stabbing her. He's not. And the appearance of him as calm and sedate is absolutely contrasted with the reality of what's going to happen to her. And he tells her, I'm always nice at first, the first time. And I'll hold you tight and you have to try to get away or pretend because you'll know you can't. I mean, he's telling her, y'all, that he's going to kill her. He's not going to let her go. And in that final moment when she looks out across the field, she knows where she's going, right? And she knows she's not coming home. He's told her that. He's told her exactly what's going to happen. And there's a futility in escape here. She can't outrun him. She can't hide from him. There's nothing she can do. It's too late. And that's terrifying. It's so scary. And so that in the beginning, that sexuality of his, that kind of that curiosity that drew her in the beginning is ultimately what's going to cause her death. And she watches that smile change. That same smile from the parking lot where he waved his hand over her, in the end is the same smile where it's awkward and it's ghoulish and it's scary. And she retreats inside her home because she knows that her house should provide her security from him and what he's becoming. And yet it can't, because he's already in her. He's already gotten to her. And so again, that appearance of the house providing protection, the appearance of who he was versus the reality of her situation. And the juxtaposition is grave and scary. And the reality of her situation sets in. And this is where we see that gothic horror tone. Okay, very much in the same style of Edgar Allan Poe and then even Flannery O'Connor. The looking at the effect of violence on the human psyche. If you think about Telltale Heart, if you think about Cask of Amontillado or The Black Cat, all of those stories by Edgar Allan Poe from the mid-1800s address violence and the role it has in our lives and how everybody is at some point capable of it or potentially the victim of it. And we can't escape it. And Joyce Carol Oates is picking up that concept and running with it again. Ultimately, in the end, y'all, Connie, because she didn't know who she was, because she was uncertain of who she was, in the end, the only identity left for her is a victim. Okay. And the reality is sad for her and heartbreaking for her because she can't stop it by the end. So the resolution of that story, y'all, she knows she's not coming back. And she has this complete loss of control and loss of innocence. Even though he hasn't physically done anything to her yet, she knows what's coming. And she knows that no matter how hard she tries to fight it or control it or handle it, she can't. Right? So she can try to fight, but she just goes with him because the battle's lost. The war is lost. And he uses this phrase in the end, my sweet little blue-eyed girl, which is song-like. But again, y'all, that plays into the appearance and reality. That before the music appeared to be fun and soothing and representative of her youth culture and who she is and her search for identity. And now it's a threat, right? Her eyes are brown. They aren't blue. And this is a sense almost like a psychological torture that he's manipulating her and he's controlling her and he's enticing her to her own death. Again, that plays into that gothic horror. Some comments here about the music again. It's throughout the entire story. And the way it changes, the way it moves is really brilliant. That it's fun in the beginning and terrifying in the end. So gender criticism can be applied to the story. Historical criticism can be applied to the story. Psychological criticism works extremely well with the story as well. So Arnold Friend, he's a really interesting character to analyze with psychological criticism. And he says something that may not seem important to him, but it's really important to Connie and to us. And he says, I promise it won't last long, and you'll like me the way you get to like people you're close to. You will. It's all over for you here. And for him, he just kind of says it off the cuff. It's not important to him, but for her, it's terrifying because it speaks to his ability to see her and see into her and her insecurity and her low self-esteem and her fear of intimacy. And she realizes that she can't like Arnold Friend, not only because he's terrifying and creepy and going to hurt her, but because she's naturally incapable of doing so. She's never really been close to anyone. She's pushed everyone away. Her mother, her sister, her friends, even these boys she's been intimate with. No one's really important to her because she's not important to herself. And she can't love anyone else until she loves herself. And sadly, by the end of the story, she's never going to have a chance. And so the psychological criticism looks into how Connie processes all of this and what it says about her psyche and what it says about her mental health and her mental awareness. So again, psychological theory here a lot of it goes back to Freud. For example, you can look at Hamlet as an Oedipal conflict. So that's like the son wanting to kill the dad and marry the mom. And Hamlet in the story is deeply connected to his mother. And you can absolutely use psychology to break this story down. Like I said, Connie can't love anyone because she can't love herself due to her low self-esteem. She's willing to go with Arnold Friend, not because she wants to, but because she thinks she has to, or she actually kind of does have to. Her situation is absolutely similar to the story, Bob Dylan's song, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, which is another reason why she dedicates the story to him. And in It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, he says, leave your stepping stones behind, something calls for you. Forget the dead you've left, they will not follow you. The vagabond who's rapping at your door is standing in the clothes you once wore. So that psychological criticism there and in this song is all about finding identity, right? And leaving something behind and stepping into the new. Unfortunately for Connie, what she's leaving behind is her existence. And the new she's stepping into, this new land, this new world that she sees, is really the afterlife. Okay? So there's so much to this story, guys. And I'm going to ask you tonight and tomorrow, there are 4 critical articles posted on Schoology, and they're all very different. One is going to focus on Bob Dylan. One's going to present Arnold Friend not as a devil figure, but as a savior, which is a little bit weird. One is about the grotesque in the story, and one is more about Connie. So I'm going to ask you to pick one of those 4 articles, and you're going to read it, and you're going to write a reflection on it, a minimum of 1 page typed and submitted on Schoology for me tomorrow. And that'll count for your attendance credit. Have a good day.